Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're doing well.
Hey,
We'll
Professor.
yo,
So you heard of La Boo-Boos. What about the
yes, I have.
Fuglies? Hold on, I'm trying to turn on my camera so you can see it. It's like, it's not working. I'll try again later, but it's a fun. I don't know what's going on my camera,
Huh.
but I'll show you before at the end of class.
Okay. Is it Labubu related?
Yes, it honestly looks like that guy off of The Goonies to me. But
Uh,
the kids don't know who the Goonies are, so
no, they don't. I love that movie. I really loved it as a kid. My sister loves it so much that she's been up to that small little town in coastal Oregon where it was filmed. I can't remember the name of the town, but it's
oh
right there on the west.
wow.
What's that?
I said, "Oh wow." I know my mother used to be a fan of the TV show Lake Placid.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was I don't even know if it was the right one. I think I may have went to the wrong one, but it was in Florida. But maybe I'm gonna fact check before I keep talking.
I think Lake Placid is in New York, in upstate New York, and
Oh,
they had the Winter Olympics there when I was a kid, in I think like 1980. So I'm pretty sure it's upstate New York, somewhere cold.
oh wow. Yeah, I was definitely in the wrong spot. But I'm gonna log out and log back in because I don't know what's going on with my camera thing.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
I've got you down for attendance. I've got all the rest of you down too. Yeah. So hope you're doing well. We're gonna continue with Max Weber today. I was just reading over your comments on the work ethic, which I thought were very interesting, especially around this second question that I posed about, do you think that younger people today, have less of a work ethic than the generations that came before? And I would say the overall kind of consensus answer seemed to be no. That like the young people today have just as much of a work ethic as their parents or grandparents, but that the nature of it has changed. And the term that kept coming up in the discussion was work life balance. That was a thing that a lot of people mentioned, that younger people today place more emphasis on having work life balance. And for a lot of people, that means like prioritizing their mental health. And in a way that like in other previous generations, maybe it was more like you were just supposed to suck it up and get through it. And so I found that kind of interesting. There were a lot of conversations that were very insightful. Um, Actually, Keisha, now I'm seeing that you just logged on, had a really interesting comment about how, and I think you said this in the chat too, in our previous discussion in our previous class, like how employers are treating employees more like they're just interchangeable, disposable, just like numbers. And employees have kind of caught on to that. And so it's like, yeah, well, why should they have any more loyalty to their employer than their employer has to them? And I thought that was a really good way of putting it. So it's not that the necessarily that people are not willing to work hard, or don't have a work ethic. It's more like there just isn't the that sense of loyalty, and people are kind of treated as disposable, interchangeable things. And so I think like the way I tried to put it was in sports terms, that like we're all just free agents now. The days of the older generation when you worked for the same company for 30 years and then got a gold watch when you retired, those days are over. And so, of course, it would makes totally rational sense for people to take on an attitude of like, like why work your ass off for some company that, may turn around and replace you with AI in like 6 months. Um, and I also, Jill, I really liked your response. I learned from you summarizing the conversations that you had working in the restaurant industry, and I think you were talking about the conversations with your boss that about these issues, and it was really insightful because it's like, oh yeah, from the employer's perspective, it's like, oh, nobody is willing to work hard enough. And I think you said like your boss had, complained a lot about younger people engaged in quiet quitting and all this sort of thing. And then your kind of rebuttal to your boss was like about, well, actually, it's not that people are lazy. It's just like they expect to be treated fair and paid
Yeah,
fair, you know? Go ahead, Jill.
right. Yeah. She and I have a discourse all the time. She is very, very, pro capitalism.
Yeah.
It has benefited her. And she's a Generation X and owns a pizza parlor in a small town that's been in the same family for 40 years. So it has really, truly benefited her.
Uh-huh.
And I've found, a really niche spot where, I do get really great like insurance and benefits and, vacation and stuff. But for the restaurant industry, that's like unheard of. And
Yeah.
so from her perspective, she's giving out these benefits and doesn't realize that other places are not doing the same thing.
Right.
And so these kids just don't work. And I'm like, well, these kids just kind of prioritize things differently because they've understood that. And she also does a lot of like reading and research about like the social movement of quiet quitting. And she's like, is that happening here? And I'm like, no, because you are actually doing good things for your staff, but it's happening elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that's happening a lot, like in, and probably like in New York and Los Angeles and,
Yeah.
bigger city environments where people have more options as far as employment.
Yeah. Or any kind of corporations, like,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, whereas like if you're in the service industry and you find a job that, you get benefits and health insurance, like yeah, hold on to it for dear life. Um, well, anyway, that was real an interesting conversation that obviously is connected with what we're talking about. Certainly, what we talked about on Monday with the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, and we'll be like kind of finishing off that reading today, and then going into Max Weber's theory of power, and the way that he says that power is rooted in class, but also in this thing that he calls status, which is like related to class, but not the same thing as class. And then also in terms of party, how like political parties or labor unions or forms of social organization, how they um, try to build power and strategically meet their interests. So that's kind of what's on tap for today. Might as well go into. I'm just going to check out the chat. Yeah, chat here. It's okay. Yeah, so it looks like you've all signed in. I'm going to go ahead, go to the screen share mode, and get into the um, reading. Okay. Oops, that's the wrong one. 1 second. Okay, we left off on this topic of asceticism. One thing about the work ethic that I've been trying to emphasize in its classic form, in the Protestant work ethic form, is that it's not only about working hard at your calling or whatever kind of occupation you're in. It's also about this thing called delayed gratification, or self-denial. It also has to do with, like, not spending the fruits of your labor on conspicuous consumption, but in fact saving it and reinvesting it. And this is what Weber is saying made the Puritans and the Protestants who came after them, how it made them especially good capitalists, because not only were they working really hard, they were taking what they earned, and instead of spending it, they were reinvesting and or saving it. And the term that Weber uses to describe this spirit is this word asceticism, which basically means kind of self-denial, or a kind of delayed gratification. He has this phrase that I particularly love because it captures how kind of boring and lifeless the Puritans were, where he says asceticism is the strict avoidance of the spontaneous enjoyment of life. That the Puritans kind of built this whole religion around the idea of not enjoying life, and sort of denying themselves all of the pleasures of the flesh. And so in this section called Asceticism and the Spirit of Capitalism, he quotes a lot from this guy Baxter. Richard Baxter was, as he describes it here, one of the sort of the OG Puritans, the English Puritans who came over to North America, in the like 16th or 17th century, fleeing religious persecution in England, and then in North America, when North America was still a colony of England, the Puritans really, set root in like the northeastern part of the country, like in Massachusetts, and these other colonies, and sort of practiced their religion there. And so Weber is quoting from Baxter for the same reason that in the earlier section he quotes from Benjamin Franklin, which is that he believes that these people really personify this spirit of capitalism. Well, the spirit of capitalism in Franklin's sense, and in Baxter's sense, that he really personifies this spirit of asceticism, of self-denial. So it starts talking about here about, like, wealth as such is a great danger. Its temptations never end, and its pursuit is not only senseless as compared with the domineering importance of the kingdom of God, but is morally suspect. So Baxter's idea here is like the idea of and Sky, you put it correctly here, like that it's about building wealth but denying oneself of the pleasures that come with wealth. And that's what basically like makes a Puritan different from a pirate, or any of these other forms of greed and accumulation that came before. There's been plenty of people who were greedy and wanted, money, wealth, power, treasure, and so forth. But they didn't. Weber's saying they didn't create a capitalist economy because whatever they gained, they just kind of immediately spent. They just immediately consumed in luxury goods or a big, party or some kind of, some kind of consumption. Whereas the Puritans have this idea from, their religion that like to do that is sinful. And there's this is why Baxter says like, that wealth is a danger and its temptations never end. So on the one hand, like wealth might be, if you're successful from the Puritan standpoint, remember this means that like you're somehow you've been chosen or saved by God. Like they interpret this as like, this is a sign from God that I am prosperous and wealthy and successful. However, my moral duty is to not spend or use that wealth for my own enjoyment. It's to put the money in the piggy bank or stuff it under the bed, or actually the better thing to do would be then to reinvest it, to reinvest that money in your business or your trade or your calling or whatever it is. And that's the thing that makes these guys such good capitalists, even though their motivations are religious, even though their motivations are towards the glory of God, they still end up being really good capitalists because they're working really hard and then they're reinvesting the earnings that come from working really hard. Go ahead, Kai.
So basically, like you were just saying with Calvinism and everything like that, like the mindset was to hoard. And I guess, like from that time till today, like the religious aspect has left, but that ideology is still here, basically.
Yeah. So the religious component of it fades away. It's like the appendix in our body that we sort of no longer need. We've kind of evolved past it. And Weber is saying basically like capitalism, once it gets going, once it becomes established, then it kind of like takes on a life of its own where it no longer needs this religious justification. It no longer needs its religious origins.
Yeah, like
Then
the
after a
seed is
while,
already planted.
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. I was just saying like the seed has already been planted.
Yeah, and then and now the plant is like, is huge and takes on, a life of its own. And, then it no longer needs the seed. Um, and so it just continues to flower and grow and develop. And what happens then is, kind of like a lot of you described this in terms of um, how you yourself were socialized into the work ethic. For a lot of you, it just becomes, a sheer issue of survival. It's not really like a moral duty or a religious, ethos of being a good person. It's like, no, you have to work hard in order just to like survive and get by in this society. And that's basically what Weber says at the end of this. He'll say, like, basically, like, the Puritans like wanted a calling. They sought out a calling. We have to do it. We have to find some way of so-called making a living. Not because like, we're under some kind of moral duty to God, but because our livelihood depends on it. And so this is why people, from the time people are 5 years old, I don't know about the rest of you, but like, I remember from the time I was a kid, pretty early on, people start asking you, what do you want to be when you grow up? There's like this kind of like economic pressure to like decide how you're going to make a living, and so for the Puritans, this would have been a matter of calling. This would have been like, what does God want me to do? What kind of spiritual purpose can I serve on earth? These sorts of questions. For us, it's like, how are we going to make a living?
I was gonna add, I feel like when you're a little kid, like when you're being asked that, it's not asking a kid what they want to be to earn income. It's what do you want to be to give back to society?
Interesting. Because when I was a kid, I was
how
always
do you
like,
contribute? I mean, well, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And like, the generic answers are like, I want to be a doctor, I want to be an astronaut, I want to be a police officer, whatever. And all of those in theory are things that give back to society.
Huh. Maybe I was in a different milieu. I remember, I mean, this is obviously antithetical to my current thing,
Yeah.
but like as a kid, I was like, oh, I know what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be rich.
Oh.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
I want to do, like, it was the 80s, and so I was like, oh, I want to do something with computers. I don't really know what to do. Like, what
I mean, maybe it just has to do with how you're socialized as a kid, and
I think,
who your
like
parents are, maybe.
in
I
an
don't know.
older conception, it's like, oh, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I want to, be a firefighter, police officer, whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that it's like just a conditioning of what society expects from you from the time you're born, with the color blanket you're given to the things that even in a commercial, like they're changing, but in past times they were, the woman was in the house and the male was outside. And even the posters for women empowerment, with the lady that has the red bandana on, I'm sorry,
Rosie the Riveter.
Exactly. But you see her attire is like a kitchen setting type attire. It's like it's like they're forming us to be what society will expect from us later, in all terms, as far as contributing, as far as our place, as far as how high we can go, and just it's all a shaping, I think.
It's like
it's definitely like an important part of how we're socialized, and how we're sort of taught about what we can like reasonably expect, and what is just like not going to be in the cards for us. It was just like, oh, it's by the time I reached a certain age, it was pretty clear I was not going to be like the first baseman for the Los Angeles Dodgers. Like, it just like, you start to you're kind of socialized into like what's a reasonable expectation, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and it just keeps going on because even in school, you have the in crowd and the out crowd, and that
Yeah.
even plays into how your adulthood will be versus, introvert versus extroverted. Like I think that everything is a stepping stone to an idea of the person you will be or the person you are expected to be.
Yeah. Right. So this is Weber is saying, like, this is something that has been important for a very long time, as far as like how we perceive this question of, like, what are we supposed to do with our lives? And I think, for the generation that he's talking about, as far as, like 16th and 17th century Puritans, they thought of it in more like kind of spiritual terms, whereas now, it's more of a narrowly economic question, like how are we going to make a living? Yeah, go ahead, Kai.
Yeah, just like to like the bridge between then and now. It was like back then they were doing it for meaning and purpose,
Yeah.
albeit, religious purposes.
Hmm.
And now it's like survival anxiety, like you were
Yeah.
saying, how am I gonna eat? It's like they scare you into you need to have a job or you're not gonna be able to eat. But
Yeah.
back then it was like, it was for meaning and purpose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I hope that people, some people at least still approach it in the way that Jill had framed it, which was like, how are you going to give back to society? Like, how are you going to contribute to your community? But that, becomes kind of a difficult thing too. I mean, it's just like a lot of, unfortunate fact about our society is that the jobs that, give back to society and contribute to our community, unfortunately, just don't pay very well. Like if they're in education or healthcare or anything, the real money is in these jobs that like don't really have any social utility, like, being a financial investment analyst or all these other kinds of things that where the Marx would say that they have high exchange value and low use value, for society. Precious, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, but it's okay. I really forgot what I was gonna say.
That's cool. No worries. So here he keeps going on with sort of quoting Baxter, and he talks about, like, waste of time is the deadliest of sins, and the span of the human life is infinitely short and precious to make sure of one's own election. So, there's a verse or phrase in the Bible, I can't remember where it is, but where they say, like, idle hands are the devil's playthings. This kind of thing of like, if you are idle or lazy, that you become, subject to temptation and sin. And so this is the kind of driving force that is causing people to work hard, even to work more than than what is necessary, and to think of work not as just like a means to an end, but work as an end in itself. So, as opposed to the idea of, what is it people say today, like, to that you should be working, uh, you should be working to live instead of living to work. And the Puritans were all about like living to work, because they thought God was like watching them, and that if they stopped working, that was like sinful.
And
Yeah.
wouldn't that link into morality? Like,
Yeah, most certainly.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is their whole moral compass is informed by this stuff about work and about time, how one spends their time is a great moral question for the Puritans, about what one should do. And so this is where Weber is saying that the spirit of capitalism ultimately comes from, is this moralistic attitude towards time and work. Yeah. And then here he describes, he goes from saying that they not only kind of like, you know, are driven to work and you know, not be lazy, but also in general just kind of anti-pleasure and purely utilitarian, not just when it comes to work and time, but also into to sex and to food and to just the overall enjoyment of life. He says the sexual asceticism of Puritanism differs only in degree, not in fundamental principle, from that of monasticism. Monasticism, like, you know, being a monk, right? Like complete self-denial and retreat from the existing world and the pleasures of the flesh. And on account of the Puritan conception of marriage, its practical influence is more far-reaching than that of the latter. For sexual intercourse is permitted, even within marriage, only as the means willed by God for the increase of his glory, according to the commandment, be fruitful and multiply. So here's the sort of the utilitarian thing about sex. Like sex is okay, but only if it's like useful for creating children, right? Like it's not supposed to be a thing that you're supposed to take pleasure in its own right, you know? And then he says, like, along with a moderate vegetable diet and cold baths, the same prescription is given for all sexual temptations as is used against religious doubts and a sense of moral unworthiness. Work hard in your calling. So not only do you work hard, but you have to have a moderate vegetable diet and take nothing but cold baths. And so it's just an all-encompassing like morality around like just not enjoying life. And then like that enjoying or taking pleasure is itself like inherently sinful. Yeah. And a lot of religions have some component to this. Like people have mentioned here in the comments too, like Mason and Paige, you both brought up good examples here about other ways in which like religion is different, religions, and to some extent all religions have some element of this, of being like basically kind of anti-pleasure, whether it's around sex or drinking or food or, the spontaneous enjoyment of life. So yeah, this is a pretty interesting section for this, where, Weber is sort of identifying this puritanical kind of morality. Yeah, and you just like to your question, Precious, around morality. It's interesting to compare Weber and Durkheim on these questions. So I sort of highlight this section here, like where Weber is saying that that Puritans believed in the calling that allowed people to pursue profits, but with the strict sense that like you are to work hard and succeed, but not for yourself, but for the moral purpose of bettering your community. And it was strictly taboo to be selfish or greedy. That is what is encapsulated in this phrase here: "You may labor to be rich for God, though not for the flesh and sin." All right, and like I got a little snarky on the comments here and said like, "Oh, someone should tell Elon Musk," this kind of thing. And my reason for pointing this out is like, well, you know, what Weber says happens is like capitalists eventually lose this whole idea of like that you have to do this for the glory of God. They just, after a while, they just purely are doing it for themselves, and for their own pleasures and luxuries, and you know, greed and power and narcissism and all these things that we see on just full display in our society now, where the accumulation of capital no longer has any connection to moral righteousness. It no longer has any kind of this, you know, connection to like self-denial. Yeah, go ahead, Kai.
No, I just want to make a comment, kind of like our president,
Yeah.
the ballroom thing. So I
Ah,
just want to say that.
totally. Same thing. Yeah. I mean, this whole it's just been such a metaphor to have watched this whole thing go down with tearing down the East Wing of to build this new ballroom in the White House. It's really ended up, I think, like shocking people in a way, and I don't think that they
Definitely.
anticipated that it was going to be that big of a deal.
Yeah, it just I don't know, I don't want to like get in the weeds or anything, but it's just interesting, with him building that and then like the whole snap thing. It's just like real interesting. I just feel like I don't know, like I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, and throwing a Great Gatsby party at Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach on the night before people's SNAP benefits are about to expire, you know?
Right,
Like,
like it just looks horrible. Like what's
totally.
yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's one of these like Marie Antoinette let them eat cake moments, you know? Mason, you had your hand up.
Because I was just gonna ask, like, because we're talking about like the connection between like religion and capitalism,
Mhm.
but like kind of tying it back to this current administration, we still see like a lot of religious messaging and stuff. Like you know, there's still a lot of like like it's kind of hard to ignore like the I can't find a better word, so I'm just gonna say Christian nationalism of it all.
Yep.
So like, would you say that like they use religion more as like a tool or like to threaten people into like doing what they want rather than like, our society is actually based on like the morality of it? Because like you see a lot of I can't remember who said this exact quote, but you see a lot of do as I say, not as I do,
Right.
um, with like our higher ups, I guess. So like, is that just more for like what they want us to do and not like what they represent? I guess I'm having a hard time phrasing this.
I think you're phrasing it right. It's kind of like I would say as a teacher, I have my own opinions about this. I would encourage you guys to answer them for yourselves. I can tell you what I think, which is that this whole sort of Christian nationalism isn't very Christian. It's really kind of I would say authoritarianism that uses Christianity, I think, in a very cynical way, to legitimate and justify their authoritarian agenda. I think it's completely disconnected from any sort um, of Jesus's teachings, or any kind of actual religiosity, and it's actually really it's really just a kind of an authoritarianism, in my view. But I'd like you all to think about those things for yourselves and come up with your own verdicts. Go ahead, Kai.
I just wanted to comment, like it just seems like they use religion as like a way to pacify people,
Yeah.
um, more so than like really, following its teachings. It's just like a tool, used to kind of like I don't know, just control people, I guess. It's like they know that, people are really passionate about it. It's whatever, they know people are like really passionate about it and they use it to their advantage more than anything else.
Yeah. I think that's also a good way of putting it, that it's kind of a tool to pacify people and get them to get in line. Yeah, I mean, I'm so sure that like if we brought Jesus back to life today, that he'd be cool with like, oh, we're going to give tax breaks to billionaires and take people's health care and, food benefits away from the poor. It's like the most Christian thing I could possibly imagine, you know? And so, yeah, I don't take these people at their word, when they describe themselves as Christian, honestly. Um, so it's not really my place to arbitrate who is who is and who isn't faithful. But I mean, I've read the Sermon on the Mount. I know what, Jesus's teachings were towards the poor and things, and like what's going on right now is like couldn't be more antithetical. Go ahead, Mason.
Because I also think about like the literacy rate in America, and like the Bible's not like a low level reading book, so like if that's up here and we're down here, then we're probably not all reading it and getting like the same meaning out of it. So like not only is it like a big game of telephone, but I feel like politicians definitely like manipulate that,
Yeah.
so like I say Christian nationalism, but it's like I still consider myself Christian for the most part. But it's
Mhm.
what I'm seeing is not like I have to say every time like I'm not affiliated with that. Like that's not,
Mhm.
like I'm very independent in my religious beliefs because I look at what everyone else is doing and I'm like, that's not, I don't know how you got there.
Yeah.
Like in my hometown, especially because I live in Tulare, so like dead center of the Central Valley. We have
Mhm.
a lot of homeless people here, and it's been getting a lot worse the last 5 years or so.
Mhm.
And there's churches lining like every street corner here. But the way people talk about homeless people is like not the way you would think if we're such a like holy
Yeah.
town.
Mhm.
Because it's real bleak here. I think we even have out like on the outskirts of town, we have a giant like fenced in area, and that's like our homeless support camp. It's basically just an encampment.
Wow.
So like it gets really bleak here, but then everyone claims to be like so spiritual, and then I see the same thing politically, and it's like I'm not sure how we're all coming to like this can like like I don't, from my perspective, I can't even figure out like modern, I don't know what to call it, but like this like faux Christianity, it's not my place to judge, but like this other version I'm seeing, I can't figure out like what its beliefs are supposed to be. Like it does seem to be here like solely for profit, because it's not about helping other people, it's not about like self-betterment, temptation. You just it's seemingly you can do whatever you want, but as long as you say I'm Christian, that you don't go to hell. And that's not how I was raised, and that's
Yeah.
not how I've interpreted the Bible. So
Mhm.
this is kind of just making me think like, is this really all just tied into like capitalism? Like, do we really just kind of worship our system more than we actually worship like a spiritual figure at this point?
Man, that's really well said, Mason, especially that last part. I couldn't have said it better myself. I share your suspicions, and I'm grateful for your input and sharing your experience. Thank you. That's really well said. Yeah. I don't have anything really to add to that. Like I said, as a teacher, I don't like telling people like what they should think. As a teacher, my goal is to guide you or to help you to kind of reach your own conclusions. I would say though, Mason, that like you are certainly not alone as a Christian who is skeptical of Christian nationalism. I think there are actually a lot of people out there, and I already know that there are several people just in this class that share um, that distinction between Christian and Christian nationalism, as you've expressed it, because I've read their stuff and I know that this is the case, and so yeah, well said, and I encourage you to keep thinking for yourself, you know, because a lot of this is about when I say authoritarianism, it's like a kind of a deliberate attempt to get people to kind of shut off their mind and to think in real like kind of binary black and white, good and evil kind of terms, and to sort of like lead people to turn off their critical thinking faculties. Yeah, go ahead, Mason.
I just had one more thought.
That's
Because
okay.
how you say it's about authoritarianism. I think also part of what's kind of shaped my beliefs is my parents did a really good job, like, raising me to be aware of authoritarianism. Like I
Mhm.
was definitely raised with the belief that, people can take my beliefs and manipulate that to get me to like, do things that are completely against my own benefit or, to even harm those around me. So I've always like kind of been like very hyper aware of like, is someone actually saying something because they believe it, or do they want me to do something for them?
Yeah,
So like with everything going on right now, it doesn't, I know what this is for. I know what's happening, like this isn't even really about my beliefs. You just want me to benefit your own agenda. And if I don't do that, then I'm, a deviant. But we throw that label out so much that it's like, from my perspective, it doesn't really mean much anymore because it's like, any naysayer, I guess, is like, they're getting really blatant now. I read a lot of what our elected officials say online, and they're
Mhm.
getting really blatant about like wanting people to die.
Yeah,
No way around that one.
yeah,
So it's just, I think when you point that out, I'm like, okay, I think that's kind of where where I kind of like not split from the church, but like I have my own beliefs and I don't really go to church like that.
yeah,
And I think it's just because I feel like in a group setting, it's really easy to kind of like get people to follow along with authoritarian beliefs. And when you're in a group, you're really not going to question as much. So
yeah,
if I do things privately and I just talk to like my family about it, there's more room for me to ask questions and develop my own perspective because I don't feel like I'm rocking the boat as much. And I feel like
yeah,
when you're in a group setting and everyone's shifting more towards something else, you may feel nervous, but if you think you're the only person in that setting that feels that type of way, you're not going to speak up.
yeah, exactly. Um, it's pretty amazing, like to look around the world and historically and to think about like all the various ways that just Christianity. I mean, we could use other examples from other religions, but if you think about like what Christianity, the wide range of things that has been used to justify, like at one point in time, the Bible was used to justify slavery, right? And was used to justify all kinds of social inequalities. Obviously, today, as I've been trying to emphasize, this is also still the case. But in other times and places, Christianity has been a tool of liberation. In fact, in Latin America, there's a whole school of like what they call liberation theology. It comes out of El Salvador, Nicaragua, these places where people, um, for them, Christianity was a movement of like the peasants and the poor rising up against their oppressors and against the empire to, create a better and more just world. And so in that context, Christianity could be very often linked with like socialism, or with more sort of egalitarian political projects. So it does, it's being used in the context of authoritarianism, but I don't think it has to be that way. In fact, also in this country, there's a long history of like religious-based movements that have, challenged the power and inequality and oppression. I mean, certainly if you look at like the civil rights movement in the 1960s, that largely comes out of the church. I mean, this is where Martin Luther King comes out of. He's just like a preacher, or like the Quakers who opposed the Vietnam War, all kinds of ways in which like it's served um, non-authoritarian means. Go ahead, Kai.
Oh, sorry. I was just, you already said it, but basically just how like the church, that its structural meaning like goes beyond, I guess, religion. And you talked about the civil rights movement and stuff, like the church was used as like a like their like headquarters to like organize, ways to kind of,
Mhm.
fight back, and and also is used as like a school to like educate them and
Yep.
X, Y, and
Yep.
Z. So, but you already said that. So yeah.
Yeah. So these can serve wildly different purposes. And so, I definitely would encourage you all to continue to, pursue and think about these ways in which like, you can your faith and beliefs can, like serve a more humane purpose. I think our world really kind of needs that. Um, and there's definitely movements, Reverend Barber leads this movement down in the South called, I can't remember what it's like, the movement for it's essentially like a poor people's movement, but it's led by Reverend Barber, um, I think in North Carolina. Um, so these kinds of things are out there, and I definitely like encourage you all to look for them. Yeah. Let me spend the last like 15 minutes trying to get through the rest of this section on asceticism. I think we've covered a lot of it, but there are probably a few things that I want to cover, and then next week we'll get into his theory of power and legitimacy. He's a lot of the sections here I've highlighted because they're nice, like this section. They're kind of like nice little short summaries of what he's talked about up to that point. Um, this is I think an especially good um, paragraph that describes this whole attitude of Puritan asceticism. The theater was obnoxious to the Puritans, and with the strict exclusion of the erotic and of nudity from the realm of toleration, a radical view of either literature or art could not exist. So it's this, I don't know if it's like a hatred or a fear of like the human body. Um, and with it, all of these forms of art and literature and theater that, often center around sexuality and eroticism. All of this, I think, has made a long-term impact on American culture. And yeah, so it's like they place all this value on work, but also this value on denying the pleasures of the self and the pleasures of the flesh. Now, here in this section is where, as it gets towards the end of this reading, this is where Weber basically explains his idea that like eventually these puritanical ideas kind of fade away. That like once a certain amount of wealth accumulates, then the sort of the religious origins of capitalism are kind of like no longer necessary. They're actually no longer really useful for capitalism. And so they kind of like fade away. Now, just doesn't mean that religion entirely leaves the scene. Obviously, as we've been talking today, religion is still very much has an active role in this society, in American society in particular. But I would also suggest that it kind of means something different. That religious faith means something different to people today than it would have been in the 17th century or the 16th century. That it's like less all-encompassing. Because these Puritans, I mean, they lived first and foremost, this was like their whole existence really centered around this. So then he describes, eventually, he says these puritanical ideas tended to give way under excessive pressure from the temptations of wealth. And he says, with great regularity, we find that the most genuine adherents of Puritanism among the classes which were rising from a lowly status, the small bourgeois and farmers, basically like tended to be the ones that were accumulating the most amount of wealth. And so, what eventually happens is that religion declines in its significance. He quotes here from this time from John Wesley, the Methodist, and he says, Wesley says, well, I fear wherever riches have increased, the essence of religion has decreased in the same proportion. So as society becomes wealthier and people become wealthier, religion declines in the same proportion, in the same kind of way. So this is where he's kind of describing this process of how this eventually kind of devolves, the religious origins of capitalism. I wanted to make sure to get to these last two sections that I've highlighted. So here he comes back to Benjamin Franklin. He says, one of the fundamental elements of the spirit of modern capitalism, and not only that, but of all modern culture, is rational conduct on the basis of the idea of the calling was born. And he says, this is born from the spirit of Christian asceticism, this idea of the calling. But then he says, when you go back and you look at Franklin, remember, is coming around later. So like the Puritans, like John Baxter, are writing in the 1600s, maybe even the 1500s, and Benjamin Franklin's writing in like the late 1700s. And as we saw in the last time, like Benjamin Franklin, he was raised in a strict, like Calvinist family, but he himself was no longer religious or, no longer like really devout. And yet Franklin still has this kind of moralizing about money and work and debt and the idea that, time is money. So Benjamin Franklin writes this whole kind of moralizing autobiography, but the moralizing is kind of disconnected now from religion. So he has this Benjamin Franklin really personifies the spirit of capitalism, but in a purely secular way. And in that sense, he's unlike John Baxter, and he's unlike these other Puritans that came before. He's espousing these ideas that have religious origins, but that no longer need religion for their justification or their legitimation. So it says one only has to reread the passage from Franklin quoted at the beginning of this essay in order to see that the essential elements of the attitude which was there called the spirit of capitalism are the same thing as what we have just shown to be the content of the Puritan worldly asceticism, only without the religious basis which by Franklin's time had died away. Okay? So he's basically saying, like, yeah, there are what Franklin is talking about is this spirit of capitalism that no longer has a religious foundation. The religious foundation of it has eroded. It's completely secular. And yet, if we trace where this spirit of capitalism came from, we eventually lead back to the Puritans and like John Baxter. And then this very important passage, very often quoted. This is the kind of the exclamation point that brings home this whole essay, where he says the Puritan wanted to work in a calling, and we are forced to do so. For when asceticism was carried out of monastic cells into everyday life and began to dominate worldly morality, it did its part in building the tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order. So just let me pause and unpack these first two sentences. The Puritan wanted to work in a calling, was like, oh, please, God, tell me, what am I supposed to do? What is my duty or responsibility? Like, what is my calling? We are forced to make this choice, as we were talking about at the beginning of today's class, because we need to make a living. We need to pay rent. We need to put food on the table. And so we have to choose an occupation, not for the glory of God, but to pay rent and put food on the table. And then he says, like, when asceticism was carried out of the monastic cells into everyday life, so monasticism, this kind of ascetic attitude that's personified by John Baxter, when this is carried into everyday life, and when it begins to dominate worldly morality, it creates this tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order. So it creates capitalism. It creates this capitalist society. This order is now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, which today determine the lives of all individuals who are born into this mechanism, not only those directly concerned with economic acquisition, with irresistible force. So basically, like, this order, this economic order, this tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order is something that we all become dependent on. It determines the lives of all the individuals who are born into this mechanism. Me and you and everybody you know is like now, in some ways, like our world, our opportunities are, all determined by this economic order, by capitalism, with irresistible force. Like, whether we like it or not, there's no way out. We all got to have a job. We all got to pay rent. We all got to pay a mortgage. We got to pay for healthcare. Whether it's fair or not, whether we want to or not, like, there's no escape. And he says, perhaps it will so determine them that until the last ton of fossilized coal is burnt, well, that's not going to happen anytime soon. We're burning more coal than ever before. In Baxter's view, the care for external goods should only lie on the shoulders of the saint, like a light cloak which can be thrown aside at any moment. But fate decreed that the cloak should become an iron cage. So in Baxter's like, okay, well, things, external goods should be these things that, like, they don't, determine our lives. They just, they're like a light cloak that we can take off if it gets too heavy. Like they should be things that, as people, we can decide, whether we want them or not. But once people's lives become determined by capitalism in this way that Weber is describing, then the cloak becomes an iron cage. So remember that, like, the iron cage is this metaphor that Weber keeps coming back to again and again and again to describe the way in which modern humanity is trapped, and trapped in a kind of a spiritually bankrupt world without meaning and purpose, in which we have more external goods, we have more things, we can buy all kinds of crap off of Amazon, we can buy all kinds of stuff at the grocery store, and yet we are spiritually empty. We are empty, devoid of meaning and purpose. That is what he means by this kind of iron cage. And so this is, again, we have reached the depths of Max Weber's despair. When we resume things next week, we'll be looking at, among other things, his writings on bureaucracy and legal authority, in which we'll see that, in some ways, like, you can see how Marx and Weber are similar in this passage, that Marx also believes that the problem with modern society is that things rule over people, things and money, commodities, material wealth determine people's lives, and it shouldn't be that way. Marx thinks that it's possible to change that arrangement with revolution. Max Weber does not. Max Weber believes that, for reasons that we will look into next week, that this that the cage is in some ways, like, kind of inescapable. I leave it for you to decide who you think is correct in this assessment. Again, this is the part where, as a teacher, I don't want to tell you what to think. I want to lead you to forming your own conclusions. Until that time, I wish you all a wonderful rest of your week and weekend. And I'll be seeing you all on Monday. Thank you very much for all of the discussion today. That was an especially robust and interesting, and I'm very appreciative of those of you who were willing to sort of volunteer your experience and your insight. And I certainly learned a lot today. And so I'm very grateful. So thank you. With that, I'm going to stop the share. And again, wish you all a good day. Bye.